Hey there YouTube, welcome back to the Allegheny Northern. Today is a car shop edition where we're going to show you how we turn a very clean gondola into a very dirty workhorse. Today we're going to use several techniques, some that I've showed you in previous videos, some that are brand new to get this dirty, mucky look. You want to see how we do it? Hang around, that's coming up next. So I'm sure many of you have some cars that could use some TLC. In the case of model railroading, TLC is not necessarily cleaning and tender loving care. It's more making it look like it's been on the road for a while. So that's exactly what I've done here to this Herzog gondola. It's going to be part of a maintenance away train that I'm going to have sitting. Most of the time it's going to be on display, so I want the models to look good. I want them to look dirty and show off a little bit of some modeling prowess. So what I've done is I've taken something that originally looked just like this and I made it look like a workhorse. Now, the techniques that I used on the trucks, you've seen already. They were used in the weathering of the locomotive, simply applying some different washes to the truck undersides. You can see the browns and the rust colors. They're subtle, but they do bring out the details. But the more important is what you're going to see here, where I've made these sort of 3D-ish rust spots. Also, probably most notable is the muck and grime inside the car. So we're going to do a very similar process here to this second one, and I'll show you step by step how we do it. Today we're going to be using AK Interactive. This is going to be some various washes. We are also going to use a combination of AK Interactive and Vallejo Pigments. Pigments, I think, in model railroading are underused. And when you look at these pigments online, you'll see that a lot of them are being used for different wargaming models and military models. But they definitely have an application here in model railroading. So we're going to go ahead and show some techniques. Obviously, these techniques can be adapted to other rail cars and to locomotives, structures, and scenery. So follow along as I'll show you step by step how we can recreate this particular pattern. Begin with weathering the trucks. We're starting off with AK Interactive's Railroad Wash. It's basically a dark brown, but it is a excellent base. It brings out the details of your trucks or whatever it is that you're weathering. So using a broad brush, you can go ahead and just apply this all over the trucks. We're going to do all four sides in a very similar fashion. You don't want it sitting too heavy. When it dries, it'll dry fairly dark, but the brown streaks will show through for the rust. Don't forget, when you're using these washes and how they sit, it is important, because if you have downward strokes, it will dry in downward strokes. If you have sideways strokes, it'll dry sideways. So think about how the grime and the dirt will be sitting on your trucks and try to mimic that with your brush strokes. We're going to go ahead and do all four sides. Okay, the next step, following immediately after applying the railroad wash to the trucks, is to apply AK Interactive's Africa Dust Effects. I want to do this while the underside of the trucks is still wet, because I want to blend the colors on the truck, and I'm using very light amounts of this. Actually, what I'll end up doing is applying it, and after it's mixed a little tiny bit, I'm going to use a paper towel to take the majority of it off. This is a highlight only, and what I'm trying to do is simulate some road grime and dust and dirt that may have been kicked up by the rails. You know, and I've actually been able to mix this fairly well with the brush, so I think I can leave that alone. That's the detail we're looking for right there, just to hit some dust and grime look. We'll repeat this process for all four trucks. And while we're waiting for the trucks to dry, we're going to go ahead and paint the couplers. We're using a very simple Testors enamel paint, rust colored. It's number 1185. And we're going to apply it right to the coupler. And we don't need to be too concerned. We're going to go ahead and free up the coupler later in case it gets paint where you don't want paint. It's almost impossible to paint it without getting it painted shut. So once it dries, we'll go ahead and free it up. But all we're looking for is just to get the paint on the coupler to get rid of the unrealistic black look and give it a more realistic, grimy, rust colored. When you're done, you should have something that looks just like that. The truck is mostly dry. Our next step is to add rust color to select locations on the truck that tend to rust in real life. To do that, we are using AK Interactive Rust Streaks. It is a wash, so it is thin. If you are looking for something that's a little more intense, you're going to need to paint it. But for our purposes, we're just going to use this wash and apply it to areas like the springs, the bearings and journal boxes, and areas typical of rust. At this time, you can also, if you'd like to apply some to the truck itself, this would be the time to do it. In streaks, remember, you are adding an accent. It's not the color necessarily of your truck. So you don't want to paint the whole thing. If you are modeling something that's of age, maybe that hasn't moved in a while, maybe a showpiece, you can go a little heavier with your rust streaks. For us, this is something here that's going to be in service, so not totally rusted. If you get an area that's sitting heavy with the paint and the wash, you can use your brush, slightly dried, to remove some of the material. We're looking for an end result that looks something like that. So we'll go ahead and do the other 3 sides and come back for the next step. Okay, with our trucks done now, we're ready to focus on the body. The first is a base coat that we'll be applying. We're using AK Interactive engine grime to do this. What we're trying to do here is simulate the base undercoat, what I'll call it. It is the essential grime and dirt of the car. So what we're going to do very simply is take a brush loaded with our engine grime and we're going to streak downward, and we're going to go over the entire car with this. And we want to make sure that we're staying in the same direction as we do this. We don't want to go from side to side or any other way other than up and down. That's how grime would be moving on the real model or on the real car. And we want to just drag this across everything, across the decals, across the body. Everything gets coated with this. Don't be afraid to put it a little bit heavier in some locations. Maybe not quite this heavy, because right now all we're doing is coating the body with this. We're not necessarily looking for any kind of detail work. We just want everything to be dirty and grimy. Before we move on to the next stage, we do want this side to dry. So we'll let this dry and then we'll take it from here on to the next phase. Okay, so we've got our whole body coated in this engine grime wash. Don't forget to do the inside. The streak marks from the paintbrush don't matter in here. I'll show you why later, but make sure you get a coat in there. We want to see some grime and some dirt, so you can see that I've applied that sort of haphazardly, and that's fine because, like I said, it's not going to matter here in a minute. The next step we want to do is we want to bring out some detail along the ribs of this car, since the supports are external in the gondola. we want to go ahead and highlight those because they are a natural location for dirt and grime to gather. So we're going to do that using AK Interactive's Streaking Grime. This step is very simple, and that is we want to put some grime in areas that are heavily dirtied during operation. In our case right now, that is our exterior supports for the gondola sides. We're going to put a lot of material on the brush, and we're going to let it flow naturally from the brush onto the model. And we're going to highlight each of these ribs as we go. And like I said, the idea here is just to add a little bit of detail, a little bit of color variation in our grime, and to bring out, if you got a model that's got any sort of rivet details or screws, anything that that may be showing on the model, this step will bring those details out. Don't forget to highlight areas like where the ladder is at and stuff like that. It also would collect dirt and grime. You can also go back, and if you want to apply a little bit to the underside, you'll notice that sometimes it wicks up the car a little bit. That's good. That looks natural. That's something that you would see. Also, because we're applying these in fairly short order here on the model, you'll notice that it's interacting with the model underneath. It's giving us a kind of a pattern almost. It's a natural looking pattern for dust and dirt, so it's something that you may want to try to mimic on your own. I highly recommend it. It does look good when it dries. One thing to remember is these washes are enamel, so they come off with paint thinner. But don't forget, that also has an effect on the model itself, especially in areas where you have decals. So if you make a mistake or you decide you don't like the way something looks, you do have an opportunity to change it. But just be careful how many times you do that, because you will, in time, you will damage the underside of the car as far as the decals and that sort of thing goes. So, okay, that's going to be our grimy car. So don't forget, this car's got multiple sides. You have to model all of the sides. So go ahead, once that dries, flip it over. Be very careful not to touch it, because if you do, you'll put your fingerprint in it and ruin the weathering you just applied. Okay, one of the last steps we're going to do with the washes is to take our railroad wash again, go to the inside of the car and apply it in any haphazard way we want, just to get another coating on the inside. You'll see in a minute why this step is important, but go ahead, get it in there. Don't worry too much about the streaking from the brush. We're going to go ahead and take care of all that in the next step. Just go ahead, get a nice coat in there, do the whole body, don't forget your sides, and then we'll move on to the pigment portion of this project. Our model is dried. This is the end result of the washes. We get a pretty grimy looking car. Let's see both sides there. And for some modelers, this may be where you get off this particular train. For some, this car is done, it's ready to go. Maybe you add a load in here, prefabricated. That's fine, you can do that. For me, this car is probably going to sit most of the time empty on the track, so I want to add a little bit of detail to the inside of the gondola and also to the sides of the car. We're going to use today a combination of AK Interactive pigments and Vallejo pigments. They operate the same exact way, and we're going to be using a Mig Pigment Fixer. And how this works is the pigments are just that. They are a powdery substance. They can be used, I'll pull a little bit out of here for you. They can be used as this powder, or they can be mixed with the pigment setting agent, the pigment fixer, and they can be turned into kind of a liquid. And how much of a liquid they become is really dependent on you. And what I mean by that is how you mix them will determine how much is pigment and how much is basically a paint. So I have this very nice, I'm going to call it a palette here, and it offers a lot of different options as far as mixing. So it's perfect for if you're painting a backdrop or just working on your models. Today we're going to be using it obviously for the pigments. So right here, we're going to take the pigment fixer and we're going to use an eyedropper to apply a certain amount to the pigment that I have in here. This is going to be our starting coat. This is AK's City Dirt. It kind of looks like runny concrete when it's set. So I'm going to take a little bit of the pigment fixer up into the eyedropper, and then I'm going to just mix enough of it to get it sort of soupy. And the more of this pigment fixer that I apply, the soupier this pigment will become. So if you want it thicker and more powdery, use less. And as you can see, as I'm mixing this in here, I've got a pretty soupy mix. And that's just what I want for this first layer, because I want it to look like something that has spilled all over the bottom of this car. So I've made it's basically a thick paint. If you can see that. It's a little blurry there, but it's basically a thick paint. And I'm going to come over to our car here, and I'm going to apply it sort of in a random pattern where I think, you know, if something would have spilled in the bottom of this car, where it might have gone, you know, into the corners a little bit, maybe off, you know, trails off here. And I'm applying it just like a paint, because in all honesty, that's pretty much what it is. It's a paint at this point. You will notice that it has some kind of a chunky feature to it, and that's good because unlike a paint, we want it to have a little bit of texture and we want it to have a little bit of density, so that you can actually make use of the pigment feature. The other thing that we can do with it is we can take it onto the side of our car and we can use it to add a little bit of muck up here, you know, some stuff that may have spilled or splashed or whatever. Don't forget too, if you're doing a gondola and it's at any point in time had ballast in it and that ballast got wet, what ends up happening is the fine dust and dirt that's on the ballast, by nature of it, you know, being a stone, tends to run off, and it looks kind of like concrete, but it's just wet dust basically. So if we imagine that there was ballast in this car, this sort of makes sense. Propped up on the side here, I'm going to take some of this pigment powder and I'm going to splash up some mud and some dirt. Now don't forget, you've already got a layer of mud and dirt under there from the washes, so you don't want to apply too much of this and undo everything you did in the last phase. This is simply the next step, and depending on the type of brush you're using, depends on the kind of streaks you can get out of it. Obviously I'm using the thin side of a wide brush right now, so I'm using it in this motion rather than this motion to sort of just streak some of this down the side here, give it a little bit of flavor. Obviously, the more that you brush at it, you can actually make this either a thicker coat or a thinner coat, and you can reveal some of the car details that are down below. So once you're satisfied with what you have, you can go ahead and flip it over. Don't forget, you're still working in 3D, so you need to take care of all the sides of the model. If you do what I just did, do make sure that the car is not resting on the stuff that you just finished, because obviously, just like paint, this stuff is wet and it will smear and smudge and give you a result that you may not have intended. Okay, so I'm happy with the way that looks now. I've got not only on the outside, but I've got the inside of the car sort of muddied up here a little bit. So something spilled inside here. So now we can go on to the next step. Okay, next up we are going to use Dark Steel. It's a pigment by AK Interactive. I've already mixed a little bit up here, and what you can see is I've made it relatively dry. So it's almost like a muck. And that's exactly what I'm looking for. I want it to look like muck in the bottom of this car. So I'm going to take it and I'm going to work it into the corners here. You'll notice it's going in like a thick paste. So it looks like dirt and garbage. And I'm just sort of moving it about with the first coat of the City Grime. And this is the effect that I'm getting. So it's kind of a dirty, grimy, thick, sludgy look. And when it dries, it's going to look just like that. It's going to look like a dirty, thick mud look. And so I'm using it in the corners of the car to represent where dirt and material and just crap has stocked up from various trips that this unit has made. And then I'm taking it a little bit out the side here. I don't want to go over everything that I've done because I want some of that city grime to come through. So I'm going to build this up in very thin layers to get a grimy bottom. And you can vary the amount of muck look by how much of the pigment setter you place inside the in your mix. So obviously the wetter you make it, the more of a paint it's like, and the drier it is, the more of a thick substance, muck look that you'll get out of it. Okay, so this is our end result after we've worked the material around. You can see it's very thick and it looks like dirt and sludge and all kinds of stuff. I did bring some of it around the body here, just to darken up some of those spots. But this thing now looks like it's been used with something. There was something in here. You can drag various items through that if you want. It's 100% workable, at least until it dries. So if you want to throw in some railroad ties, some pallets, those are some items we're going to throw in here in just a second to make it look like it's been used. This would be the time to do it now. You can set it in that pigment, and when the pigment dries, it'll bond. Final interior, added the couple of ties, also added some pallets. Now we've got the impression that this car was just coming back from a maintenance of way trip, and these are the leftover parts and pieces that as the railroaders were cleaning up and moving out, they just chucked in the back of this gondola to take back with them rather than leave it railside. Okay, the last step, the final step that we have to do is to add some rust marks to the side of the car. Once again, we're going to turn to the pigments. This time we're using Vallejo. We have three options here. We have a burnt rust red. We have a maroon oxide, which is a brown oxide type color. And we've got it's like a yellowish, it's called Old Rust. So we're going to use these three colors on the side here. And we're going to do a couple of different techniques. So the first, you're going to see we're going to apply to the side, and we're going to apply it relatively thick. So like we did with the darker of the mud colors. Then we're going to apply a little bit lighter coat to give you the streaking effect, like we would with the wash. And the last item that we're going to do is we're going to apply a dry powder, and we're going to flick that onto the already applied rust colors to give our rust some body. So I'll show you how we do that here in just a second. Okay, so our car is prepped and ready to go. I've already started by taking some of this is the brown rust, and I've made it very watery because this is our undercoat. And if you recall, most rust, almost all rust, is going to start very light, and then as it gets towards the center, it gets darker. So what we're going to do is we're going to apply this a little bit heavier than we would with some of the other washes that we made. Now, don't forget, this is a pigment, because this is our base coat. And this is what everything else is going to be built up on. And I just want to get a couple of areas highlighted where we don't necessarily want to undo all of our details and rust the whole car out in this case. So I've got 2 areas selected. And I'm going to take those 2 areas and I'm going to continue to build on them. So I'm going to take my brush now, and I'm going to mix a little bit of the burnt. I'm going to make this a little bit thicker. So I'm not going to put nearly as much pigment set in it because I want it to be, I don't want it to be as liquidy. I want it to be a little more mushy. Not quite as mushy as what we did with the inside car, but thicker than what we applied in the first coat. And then I'm just going to work this over here so that I get that darker color. Staying clear of the outside because I don't want to go over the edge. I want the edge to still have that light color to it. And as you can see, I've built up a little bit of bulk there so that it's got a little bit of texture. It's got a 3D pop. That's what we're looking for. So I'll go ahead and do the rest of the car, and we'll come back for the final step. Here they're still wet, and our final step is going to be kind of an interesting one. We're going to take some dry powder. This is the lightest. This is the old rust color, and we're going to put just enough of it on our brush so that there's a little bit of a pile. And then we're going to come over to our model, and we're just going to tap the brush so that that material comes off. And we want it to set right where we just added our rust spots so that it's going to bond right into. And you can apply this as much as you would like so you get the texture you're looking for. Okay, and when you get it to this stage, that's your heavy rust spot where the car has not only rusted, but you can tell that it's built up some crud. So some things have spilled down the side, the car has gotten rusted, pieces have, bulged and become deformed, and you can do all of that without actually deforming the car. So you end up with a look that's just like that. This is a pretty powerful look, so be careful with it. If you take a car and you do this all over it, it's gonna look rough. It's gonna look like it shouldn't be in service anymore. So this is sort of a sparing technique, but the results are very convincing, and they look really good. I'm gonna go ahead and finish the rest of the car. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope these techniques are something that you can use on your own equipment.